I want you to remember this moment with me, because for the rest of my life, I will measure time by it. Before that Friday, and after. It was 4:47 in the afternoon. I remember the exact minute because I was staring at the clock on my microwave, waiting for it to hit 5 so I could stop pretending I was still working and just go sit on my porch with a cup of tea I didn't even want. My phone rang. The screen said a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, the kind of call I usually let go to voicemail. I almost didn't answer it. If I hadn't answered it, I think my brother would still have everything. The house, the land, my father's name on a deed that should have meant something to all of us, not just to him. I think I would still be sitting in my small apartment across town, pretending I had made peace with losing my own inheritance, telling myself that family isn't about money, that I didn't need any of it, that I was the bigger person for staying quiet. But I answered it. "Is this Margaret Hale?" the voice on the other end asked. Calm, measured. The voice of a man who has spent 40 years choosing his words before he says them. "This is Margaret," I said. "My name is Thomas Bennett. I'm a senior partner at Bennett, Voss & Cole. I believe your father, Walter Hale, was a client of our firm many years ago." I sat down. I don't know why, but my legs just stopped wanting to hold me up. "Yes," I said. "He was. He passed away 8 months ago." "I know," Thomas Bennett said. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Mrs. Hale, may I call you Margaret? I need about 20 minutes of your time. There are some things about your father's estate that I believe you are not aware of. And I think, once you hear them, you're going to want to sit down somewhere you can stay sitting for a while." I was already sitting. But somehow, I understood exactly what he meant. That phone call would lead me into the most exhausting, most frightening, and ultimately the most clarifying 8 weeks of my life. It would force me to look my own brother in the eye and ask him questions I never thought I would need to ask. It would mean late nights with documents spread across my kitchen table, a forensic examiner squinting at signatures under a magnifying lamp, and a courtroom where I would have to stand up and tell the truth, even though telling the truth meant breaking my family apart for good. But to understand why that phone call mattered so much, you need to understand what happened before it. You need to understand my family. You need to understand my brother. And you need to understand exactly what we lost the day my father got sick. So let me take you back. Not to that Friday, but to the beginning. I grew up in a house on Larkspur Lane, a quiet street with old oak trees that dropped their leaves in October and made the whole block smell like cinnamon and wood smoke. My father, Walter Hale, built a small construction business from nothing. He started with one truck and a toolbox he'd inherited from his own father, and by the time I was in high school, Hale Construction had built half the houses in our county. My mother, Eleanor, kept the books for the business in the early years, sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of receipts long after my brother and I had gone to bed. She was a quiet woman, gentle in a way that made people underestimate how sharp she actually was. She noticed everything. She just rarely said anything out loud. My brother Gregory was 4 years older than me. Growing up, I adored him the way younger sisters adore older brothers who let them tag along. He taught me how to ride a bike on the gravel driveway. He let me sit in the passenger seat of Dad's truck and pretend I was driving. For a long time, I thought Gregory was the best person I knew. But there was always a difference in how my parents treated us, and it took me years to really see it clearly. Gregory was the son who would carry on the family name. He was groomed, gently but persistently, to take over the business one day. I was the daughter who was expected to be supportive, agreeable, and grateful for whatever came my way. I don't say that with bitterness, not anymore. I say it because it matters for what happened later. I remember one summer, I was maybe 14, and my father took us both out to walk the boundary line of a piece of land he'd just bought along the river. He pointed out where he imagined 2 small houses going up one day, one for each of us, so neither of you ever has to wonder where home is. Gregory rolled his eyes and said he'd rather have the bigger lot near the road, where the building costs would be lower. I remember laughing at the time, thinking it was just teenage bravado. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the first small sign of how Gregory had already started measuring our father's love in acres and square footage, long before any of us understood what that would eventually cost. My mother used to say that Gregory and I were cut from different cloth, and she didn't mean it unkindly. Gregory wanted certainty, a fixed place in the world, a title, a name on a building. I wanted freedom, the ability to build something entirely my own, even if it was smaller and slower to grow. For most of our childhood, those two different wants lived comfortably side by side. It was only later, when an estate worth real money was on the table, that the difference between us stopped being a quirk of personality and became something far more consequential. When I was 26, I left the family business to start my own small accounting practice. I wanted something that was mine, something I had built with my own hands, instead of inheriting expectations along with a paycheck. My father was disappointed, I think, but he never said it outright. My mother told me quietly in the kitchen one evening that she was proud of me for wanting something separate. That memory matters to me more now than it did then. Gregory stayed. He worked alongside my father for almost 20 years. He learned the business, the contracts, the land deals, and over time, my father started handing him more and more control, not just of the company, but of the family's finances in general. Walter trusted Gregory with everything: bank accounts, property records, eventually, power of attorney, in case anything ever happened to either of my parents. I want to be honest with you. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It made sense, didn't it? Gregory was there every day. He understood the business. I had my own life, my own work, my own family to take care of. Why wouldn't my parents lean on him? What I didn't understand, what none of us understood, was how much room that kind of trust leaves for someone to quietly, carefully rearrange the truth. It started small. A property sold without much discussion. A temporary loan from the family trust to cover a business expense. Little decisions that Gregory made on his own. Decisions he always explained away as just handling things so Mom and Dad don't have to worry. I noticed. I always noticed. But I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself my brother loved our parents and wouldn't do anything to hurt them. I was wrong. And the cost of being wrong arrived the year my father got sick. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March. Pancreatic cancer, already advanced by the time the doctors found it. My father was 71 years old, still strong enough to climb a ladder and check a roofline himself, still sharp enough to argue with contractors about cement mixtures. The disease took that from him faster than any of us were prepared for. I drove to my parents' house every weekend that spring. I sat with my mother in waiting rooms that smelled like hand sanitizer and bad coffee. I watched my father grow smaller in his hospital bed. His hands that had built half our town, now too weak to hold a glass of water without shaking. Gregory was there too, of course. He took over scheduling the doctor's appointments, managing the insurance paperwork, talking to the oncologist directly. I was grateful for that, honestly. It felt like one less thing for my mother to carry. But somewhere in those months, something shifted. Gregory started talking to me less and to our parents more, privately, behind closed doors, in conversations I wasn't invited to. When I asked my mother what they discussed, she would smile a tired smile and say, "Just business things, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." In May, my father asked to see me alone. It was one of his clearer days. He held my hand and told me he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. He said the family home, half of the company's remaining assets, and a portion of the land we'd grown up on were meant to go to me. He said he'd already told his lawyer, a man named Thomas Bennett, who had handled the family's legal matters since before I was born, exactly how he wanted things divided. "I don't want you to ever feel like you got the smaller piece, Maggie," my father told me, his voice thin but certain. "You built your own life, and I respect that more than you know. This isn't about who stayed. It's about what's fair." I cried. I told him I didn't need anything, that I just wanted more time with him. He squeezed my hand and said, "That's exactly why you should have it." I didn't know, sitting there in that hospital room, that those words would become the most important evidence I'd ever need. I want to tell you about that room for a moment, because I've replayed it so many times since that I can describe it with my eyes closed. The blinds were half open, letting in a thin strip of afternoon light that fell across the foot of the bed. There was a vase of yellow tulips on the windowsill that my mother had brought in that morning, already starting to wilt in the dry hospital air. My father's voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, but his eyes were completely clear that day, sharper than they'd been in weeks. He wasn't confused. He wasn't medicated into vagueness. He knew exactly what he was telling me, and he wanted to make sure I understood it before he said anything else. "I'm going to call Bennett myself," he told me that day, squeezing my hand for emphasis. "I don't want there to be any confusion later. I want it in writing, properly, the way it should be." I told him not to worry about paperwork, that I just wanted to spend whatever time we had left simply being together. He shook his head, gently but firmly. "Maggie, paperwork is how people show they meant what they said, long after they're not around to say it again." I didn't fully understand the weight of that sentence until many months later, sitting in Thomas Bennett's office with my father's handwritten letter in my hands. My father passed away in late June, peacefully, surrounded by family, in the house on Larkspur Lane that he loved more than anything except the people inside it. I want to remember that part clearly, because grief made the months after his death blur together in ways that still confuse me when I try to recall the exact order of things. What I do remember, with painful clarity, is the day of the will reading. Because that was the day I learned that the will my father described to me in that hospital room was not the will that existed anymore. We gathered in Gregory's living room 3 weeks after the funeral. My mother sat on the couch, pale and quiet, twisting a tissue in her hands. Gregory sat across from her in an armchair, calm in a way that, looking back, should have unsettled me more than it did. The lawyer present that day was not Thomas Bennett. It was a younger attorney named Daniel Pierce, someone I'd never met, someone Gregory introduced as the family's new estate counsel, without much explanation. Pierce read through the document in a flat, professional tone. The house on Larkspur Lane, left to Gregory. The remaining shares of Hale Construction, left to Gregory. The undeveloped land along the river, the land my father always said he wanted split evenly between us, left to Gregory, in full. I sat there, waiting for my section, waiting for the part where Pierce said my name and described what my father had promised me in that hospital room. It never came. The only mention of me in the entire document was a single sentence: a one-time distribution of $15,000 in recognition of her independence. I remember the room going very quiet. I remember looking at my mother, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I remember looking at Gregory, who finally did meet my eyes, and in his expression, I saw something I had never let myself see before. Not grief, not discomfort, just a calm, settled certainty, like a man checking a box on a form he'd already filled out a long time ago. "This isn't right," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Dad told me himself, in May, that I was getting half the estate. He told me he'd already spoken to Thomas Bennett about it. "This is the most recent will, Margaret," Pierce said gently. "Dated in April. It supersedes anything discussed afterward unless it was formally amended." April. A month before my father told me, with absolute certainty, what he wanted for me. A month before he held my hand and said, "This isn't about who stayed." I looked at my mother. "Mom, did you know about this?" She finally looked up and her eyes were wet. "Gregory said it was just cleaning up some old paperwork," she said softly. "He said your father wanted it updated before he got too sick to think clearly. I didn't read it carefully, sweetheart. I trusted your brother to handle it." Those 5 words would echo in my head for months. I didn't make a scene that day. I want to be honest about that, because I know some of you watching this might expect me to have stood up and screamed, to have thrown something, to have called my brother every name I could think of. I didn't do any of that. I sat very still, and I said, "I'd like a copy of this will, please." And then I went home, and I cried until I had no tears left. And then I started thinking. Because something about April didn't add up. My father had been weak in April, weaker than he'd ever admit to being. And weak men sign things they don't fully understand, especially when the person guiding their hand is someone they've trusted their entire life. I didn't know yet how I would prove it. But I knew, sitting alone in my kitchen that night, that I was not going to simply accept, "This is the most recent will," as the end of the story. In the weeks that followed, Gregory moved fast. Faster than grief should allow anyone to move, if you ask me. He had the locks changed on the house on Larkspur Lane within 10 days of the will reading. He told me it was for security, now that the house was technically vacant. He didn't offer me a key. He started referring to the company as his, in conversations with old family friends, dropping the hours that had always been there before. He listed 2 of the undeveloped river lots for sale within a month, lots my father had specifically mentioned wanting to split between us. When I asked him about it, he said, "Dad's gone, Maggie. Someone has to make decisions, and it's not going to be you. You walked away from this business years ago." That sentence cut deeper than I expected it to. You walked away, as if choosing my own career had been a kind of abandonment, as if loving my father from a different kind of life made me less entitled to what he wanted to leave me. My mother moved into a smaller condo that Gregory arranged for her, to simplify things. I offered to have her stay with me instead, but Gregory insisted the condo was already paid for and more practical, given her age and her health. When I visited her there, she seemed smaller somehow, quieter, like a woman who had learned it was easier not to ask too many questions. I started calling her more often, just to check in, just to listen. And slowly, in fragments, she started telling me things she hadn't told me before. She told me that in March and April, while my father was declining quickly, Gregory had been the one managing almost all of his paperwork. She told me Gregory often visited the house with documents for my father to sign, sometimes late at night, sometimes when my father was tired and in pain and just wanted to be left alone. She told me she remembered Daniel Pierce visiting the house exactly once, for less than 20 minutes, on a day my father had taken extra pain medication that morning. "I should have paid more attention," my mother told me one afternoon, her voice breaking. "I just didn't want to fight with anyone. Your father was dying, Maggie. I didn't want our last months with him to be full of arguments about paperwork." I understood that. I really did. Grief makes people want peace more than they want vigilance. But understanding it didn't make the situation any less wrong. I asked my mother if she remembered Thomas Bennett's name ever coming up in those months. She paused for a long moment before answering. "Your father asked about him once," she said. "He asked Gregory to call him, actually. Sometime in April, I think. Gregory told him he already had, and that everything was being taken care of." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Because if my father had asked for Thomas Bennett, the lawyer who had handled our family's affairs for decades, the lawyer my father trusted enough to mention by name from his hospital bed in May, and Gregory had told him that call had already happened. I needed to know if that call had actually been made. There was a moment, around that same time, that I think about often. I went to the Hale construction office one afternoon, ostensibly to pick up a box of my father's old project files he'd kept at his desk, for sentimental reasons. Gregory wasn't expecting me, and when I walked in, I caught him on the phone with someone, his voice low and clipped in a way I didn't recognize. He hung up quickly when he saw me, a little too quickly, and asked what I needed in a tone that felt more like a question to a stranger than to his own sister. I told him about the box. He had one of the junior employees retrieve it instead of getting it himself, and the entire exchange took less than 4 minutes. As I carried the box to my car, I glanced back through the office window and saw him still standing at his desk, watching me leave, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. It was such a small moment, 4 minutes and a cardboard box, but it told me something important. Whatever he was building in that office, in those months, it was something he didn't want me anywhere near. I want to pause here and talk about my mother, because I think it's important you understand her, not as a passive figure in this story, but as someone who was also being managed, also being controlled, in ways she didn't fully recognize until much later. Eleanor Hale was never a woman who challenged authority easily. She came from a generation where wives deferred to husbands, where children deferred to whichever sibling had been designated responsible. After my father passed, that deference simply transferred to Gregory. He became, in her mind, the man of the family, the one who handled things, the one whose decisions you didn't question, because questioning him felt disrespectful to the memory of the household my father had built. I started visiting her every Sunday, bringing groceries, sitting with her over tea, asking gentle questions about the months before my father died. I never pushed too hard. I let her come to her own memories in her own time. It was during one of these visits, in early August, that she told me something that changed the entire shape of what I suspected. "Gregory told me you didn't want anything from the estate," she said quietly, staring into her teacup. "He said you'd told him, after Dad's diagnosis, that you just wanted to be left alone to grieve, and that you didn't want to fight over money." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Mom, I never said that. I never said anything close to that to Gregory." She looked up at me, and for the first time since my father's death, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not fear of Gregory exactly, but fear of what it might mean if everything she'd believed for the past several months wasn't true. "He told me that's why the will was written the way it was," she continued. "He said you'd agreed to it. He said you two had talked about it together, and that you wanted your father to be at peace, not worrying about an even split while he was dying." I had never had that conversation. Not with Gregory, not with anyone. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether something was wrong and started understanding the shape of what had actually happened. Gregory hadn't just managed paperwork. He had managed the story. He had told my mother one version of events, and presumably told other people, friends, perhaps even Daniel Pierce, a similarly tidy, conflict-free narrative where I had voluntarily stepped aside. It was a clever lie in its way, because it explained away every uncomfortable question before it could even be asked. Why isn't Margaret in the will? Because she didn't want to be. Why isn't she fighting this? Because she agreed to it. I sat with my mother for a long time that afternoon, holding her hand the way my father had held mine in that hospital room. I told her the truth, gently, without anger. I told her I had never said those words, never had that conversation, and that I intended to find out exactly what had happened to my father's real wishes. My mother cried, not loudly, just quietly, the way she did everything. And then she said something I will never forget. "I want to help you find the truth, Maggie. I think I've been afraid of it for a long time." That was the day my mother stopped being someone Gregory could fully control. And it was the day I decided I needed more than memories and suspicion. I needed evidence, and I needed someone who knew how to find it. Before I left her condo that evening, my mother asked me to wait a moment. She disappeared into her bedroom and came back holding a small wooden box I recognized immediately. My father's old box, the one he kept on his dresser for years, where he stored cufflinks, a pocket watch that no longer worked, and a handful of photographs he never bothered to put in albums. "I don't know if there's anything useful in here," she said, handing it to me. "But I think you should have it. I think your father would have wanted you to have it before anyone else went through his things." I held that box on my lap the entire drive home, not opening it until I was sitting alone at my own kitchen table. Inside, beneath the cufflinks and the broken watch, was a folded piece of paper I almost missed entirely. A torn corner of a notepad, with a phone number written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, and beside it, 3 words: "Call Bennett, Monday." I didn't know yet what that note would eventually mean, but I kept it. I kept everything. Because some instinct, deeper than logic, told me that every small scrap of my father's handwriting might one day matter more than I could possibly understand in that moment. A few weeks after that conversation with my mother, I drove to the condo to help her sort through some old boxes she'd brought from the house on Larkspur Lane before the move. Boxes Gregory hadn't bothered to go through himself, full of old photographs, tax records, my father's handwritten notes from decades of running his business. It was late, past 9 in the evening, and my mother had already gone to bed. I was sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by half-opened boxes, when I found a worn manila folder labeled, in my father's own handwriting, "Estate Final Wishes." My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated in early May, after the supposed final will from April, outlining, in my father's own words, exactly what he wanted. The house split fairly, the river land divided evenly, the company shares distributed according to a plan he described in careful, deliberate language, clearly written by a man who knew exactly what he was saying, even if his hand trembled with every word. At the bottom of the letter, he had written, "Spoke with Bennett today. He is drafting the updated documents. Will sign as soon as he sends them." He had spoken with Thomas Bennett, in May, after the April will that left everything to Gregory. I sat on that living room floor for almost an hour, reading that letter over and over, feeling something complicated rise in my chest. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but a strange, sad clarity. My father had tried. He had reached out to the one person he trusted to make things right. And somehow, that effort had never reached its conclusion. Either Thomas Bennett never followed through, or someone made sure he never got the chance to. I knew which one I believed. But believing something and proving it are two very different things, and I am, by training, an accountant, someone who deals in evidence, in numbers, in things that can be verified. I wasn't going to walk into a courtroom with a feeling. I needed documents. I needed a paper trail. And I needed someone who understood estate law far better than I did. I thought about the name on that letter. Bennett. Thomas Bennett, of the firm my father had trusted for decades, the same firm Daniel Pierce had apparently replaced, without anyone fully understanding why. I didn't know it yet, but Thomas Bennett had not forgotten my father. Not at all. He simply hadn't known, until much later, that his services had been quietly redirected, and that an entirely different attorney had filed an entirely different will under his old firm's name. I made a decision that night, sitting on my mother's living room floor with my father's letter in my hands. I was going to find Thomas Bennett myself. It took me almost 2 weeks to track down Thomas Bennett's office. The firm my father had used for 30 years, Bennett, Voss, and Cole, had moved locations twice since I was a child, and the man I eventually reached on the phone sounded surprised, almost startled, to hear my father's name mentioned in connection with recent estate paperwork. "Walter Hale," Thomas Bennett said slowly, the first time we spoke. "I haven't drafted anything for Walter Hale in, let me think, almost a year. The last time I spoke with him was probably 8-9 months before he passed, when he came in to update his original trust documents. We discussed some changes he wanted to make, but he told me he needed time to think it over with his wife before finalizing anything." My stomach dropped. "He told me, in May, just before he died, that he had already spoken with you about updating his will. He said you were drafting the new documents." There was a long pause on the line. "Margaret," Thomas Bennett said carefully, "I never received a follow-up call from your father in May. I never drafted updated documents for him. As far as my office's records show, the last will I have on file for Walter Hale is one drafted nearly 6 years ago, a will that splits his estate evenly between his 2 children." I felt the room tilt slightly around me. Then who filed the will that was read at my brother's house? I asked. It was dated in April. It listed an attorney named Daniel Pierce. Another pause, longer this time. I don't know that name, Thomas Bennett said. But Margaret, I want you to understand something important. If a will was filed using documents that didn't go through our office, using a different attorney, perhaps drafted under pressure or without your father's full understanding, that is a very serious legal matter. That isn't just a family disagreement. That could be fraud. I sat with that word for a long moment. Fraud. It felt enormous and small at the same time. Enormous because of what it implied about my brother. Small because somehow, deep down, some part of me had already known that's exactly what this was. I'd like to bring you what I have, I told him. A letter my father wrote in May. He mentioned speaking with you directly in it. Bring everything you have, Thomas Bennett said. And Margaret, don't discuss this with your brother yet. Not until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. I drove to his office 3 days later with my father's letter, a copy of the April will Pierce had filed, and every scrap of memory my mother had shared with me. Thomas Bennett read through everything in near total silence, occasionally pausing to make notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was the careful, measured expression of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and knows exactly how serious it is. I think your father tried to update his will the way he told you he did, Thomas Bennett said. And I think someone made sure that update never happened, or made sure a different document took its place. We're going to need to look very closely at the April will, the signatures, the witnesses, the dates, everything. What happens now? I asked. Now, Thomas Bennett said, we find out the truth. Quietly, carefully, and with evidence strong enough that no one can argue with it once we're finished. What followed was 8 weeks of work that I never could have imagined myself capable of before that summer. I learned more about probate law, forensic document examination, and estate fraud than I ever thought I'd need to know in my entire life. Thomas Bennett brought in a forensic document examiner named Carol Whitfield, a soft-spoken woman with decades of experience analyzing signatures, ink patterns, and paper aging for legal disputes. I sat across from her at a long conference table the first time she examined the April will, watching her work with a magnifying lamp and a set of reference signatures my father had used on other documents over the years. Your father's signature changes slightly depending on his health and how quickly he was writing, Carol explained to me. That's normal. What's not normal is what I'm seeing here. She showed me the signature on the April will next to several signatures from earlier documents, old contracts from Hale Construction, a signed birthday card my father had given me years before, his signature on my parents' joint bank documents. The pressure pattern is different, Carol said. The pen lifts in places where your father's natural signature doesn't lift. And look here. She pointed to the date beside the signature. This ink is from a different pen than the signature itself. That's unusual for a single signing event. It wasn't conclusive yet. Carol was careful to tell me that. But it was enough to justify a deeper investigation. Thomas Bennett, meanwhile, worked on tracking down Daniel Pierce. It turned out Pierce was not part of an established estate law firm at all. He operated a small, mostly unknown practice that handled a wide range of legal work, from minor traffic disputes to occasional real estate closings. Nothing about his background suggested deep expertise in estate planning. That's a red flag in itself, Thomas Bennett told me. Why would your father, who had a 30-year relationship with our firm, suddenly switch to an attorney with almost no estate law experience, unless someone else made that decision for him? We requested copies of every document related to the April will, the engagement letter, the witness statements, any correspondence between Pierce's office and my father. It took weeks of formal requests and a few uncomfortable phone calls, but eventually, the documents arrived. What we found nearly took my breath away. The witness who signed the April will alongside my father was not a neutral third party, as is generally required by law. The witness was a woman named Patricia Voss, Gregory's girlfriend at the time, someone he had been dating for less than a year, someone with absolutely no independent relationship to my father at all. In most jurisdictions, a will witness needs to be a disinterested party, someone with no personal stake in the outcome. Patricia Voss, as Gregory's girlfriend, had an obvious and direct interest in seeing Gregory inherit everything. "This is significant," Thomas Bennett told me, his voice carefully controlled but unmistakably energized. "Combined with Carol's signature analysis, combined with your father's own letter describing his intentions in May, we may have enough here to formally contest this will." I remember sitting in his office that day, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not just anger at my brother, though that anger was very much present. Something steadier than anger, something closer to resolve. "I need you to understand something before we go any further," Thomas Bennett said, looking at me directly. "If we move forward with this, it's going to be painful. It's going to mean accusing your brother, formally and publicly, of fraud. There's no quiet way to do this. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my father in that hospital room, holding my hand, telling me this isn't about who stayed, it's about what's fair. I thought about my mother, finally finding the courage to question a story she'd been told to simply accept. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared." I won't pretend those 8 weeks were easy. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, surrounded by photocopies of bank statements and old contracts, my eyes burning from staring at fine print until the words stopped making sense. There were days I doubted myself completely, wondering if I was destroying my family over a misunderstanding, wondering if grief had simply made me paranoid, wondering if Gregory really had believed, in some twisted way, that he was doing the right thing. I called Thomas Bennett once, late on a Tuesday, after a particularly difficult conversation with an old family friend who'd heard rumors about a dispute, and asked me, not unkindly, if I was sure I wanted to drag the family through all this. I remember sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, asking Thomas the same question out loud, almost pleading for him to tell me I was overreacting. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady on the other end of the line, "I've handled estate disputes for almost 40 years. I've seen families talk themselves out of pursuing the truth because pursuing it felt impolite. I've also seen what happens to people who let that politeness cost them everything they were promised. You are not destroying your family. Whatever damage exists here was done long before you picked up that phone. You are simply choosing not to let it stay hidden." That conversation stayed with me through every difficult night that followed. It became something I repeated to myself, almost like a small prayer, whenever the guilt crept back in. Whatever damage exists here was done long before you picked up that phone. Once we decided to move forward, things accelerated quickly, and so did Gregory's behavior, though he had no idea yet that we were watching closely. In late September, Gregory listed the house on Larkspur Lane for sale. Our childhood home, the house my father built with his own hands, put on the market without a single conversation with our mother or me. When I called him, furious, demanding to know why, he told me, with a casualness that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it, "It's my house, Maggie. I can do what I want with it." "Mom hasn't even fully moved out of her things," I said. "Mom's fine with it," Gregory said. "She knows it's time to let go." I didn't argue further. I didn't need to. Every rushed, careless decision Gregory made in those weeks only strengthened the case Thomas Bennett was building. A man confident in his legal right to an inheritance doesn't usually rush to liquidate it before any formal dispute has even begun. A man worried about what an investigation might uncover does exactly that. Around the same time, Carol Whitfield completed her full forensic analysis of the April will. Her conclusion, delivered in careful, technical language, was that the signature showed significant indicators of being produced under physical strain, inconsistent with the decedent's documented signing patterns during the same time period, and that the ink discrepancy between the signature and the date strongly suggested the document had been altered or completed in more than one sitting. In plain terms, my father likely hadn't signed that will the way the document claimed he had. Thomas Bennett also managed, through careful legal channels, to obtain a sworn statement from a nurse who had cared for my father during his final months. She remembered, with surprising clarity, an afternoon in April when Gregory brought some papers for my father to sign. An afternoon when my father had been given an increased dose of pain medication that morning, due to a particularly difficult night. She remembered my father seeming confused, asking what he was signing, and Gregory telling him gently, "Don't worry about it, Dad. It's just the same paperwork as before. Just sign where I show you." The same paperwork as before. It wasn't the same paperwork. Not even close. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly. Reading that nurse's statement was one of the hardest moments of this entire experience. Not because it surprised me, by that point very little surprised me anymore, but because it confirmed, in painful detail, exactly how my father had spent some of his last conscious, vulnerable months, being guided, gently and persistently, towards signing away the very promises he'd made to me. I cried reading that statement. I'm not ashamed to say that. I cried for my father, who deserved better than to be managed in his final days. I cried for myself, for the promise that had been quietly erased. And I cried, strangely, for Gregory too, for the brother who taught me to ride a bike, who had become someone capable of this. But crying doesn't undo fraud. Evidence does. And by early October, we had enough evidence to take this into a courtroom. "We're ready to file," Thomas Bennett told me. "Are you?" I thought about that Friday phone call months earlier, the one that started all of this. I thought about how close I had come to letting it go to voicemail. "I'm ready," I said. "There's something I haven't mentioned yet, something I think matters to this part of the story." During those final weeks before we filed, I drove out to the Riverland one quiet Sunday afternoon, the same land my father had once walked with Gregory and me, pointing out where he imagined two small houses standing one day. The for sale sign Gregory had posted was still standing near the road, slightly tilted from a recent storm. I stood there for a long time, looking out over the water, trying to remember the sound of my father's voice describing a future that never quite arrived the way he'd imagined it. I didn't cry that day, which surprised me. I think I'd already done enough crying by then. What I felt instead was something steadier, a kind of quiet determination that didn't need tears to prove it was real. I thought about that 14-year-old version of myself, laughing at Gregory's practical complaints about lot size, never imagining that those same instincts would one day cost our family everything we'd once taken for granted. I straightened the tilted sign before I left, an oddly small gesture, but it felt important somehow, a way of saying, even just to myself, that I still cared about this land, regardless of what happened in court. I have to take you back, just for a moment, to fill in something I left out earlier, because there's a second Friday call in this story, one that mattered just as much as the first, and I think you deserve to understand both. The first Friday call was Thomas Bennett reaching out to me, all those months ago, the call that started this entire investigation. The second Friday call came in late October, after months of forensic analysis, sworn statements, and careful legal preparation. It came from Thomas Bennett again, but this time, his voice had a different quality to it, less careful, more direct, almost relieved. "Margaret," he said, "I need you to come into the office. We have everything we need to file a formal will contest, and I want to walk you through exactly what happens next, step by step, before we move forward." I sat across from him that afternoon, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, he laid out the complete picture in front of me. The timeline, the forensic findings, the witness statements, my father's handwritten letter, all of it arranged like puzzle pieces finally locked into place. "Here's what we know," Thomas Bennett said. "Your father intended, as recently as May, to update his will to split the estate evenly between you and your brother. He told you this directly, and he documented it in his own handwriting. He attempted to contact our firm to formalize this, a call that, as far as our records show, never reached me, despite your father's clear intention to make it." He paused, letting that settle. "Instead, A will dated in April, a month before your father's documented intentions, was filed using an attorney with no prior relationship to your father, witnessed by a woman with a direct personal interest in your brother, inheriting everything, and bearing a signature that our forensic examiner believes shows clear signs of having been signed under significant physical and possibly cognitive strain. In plain English, I said quietly, Gregory had Dad sign something he didn't fully understand, right before Dad tried to fix things the way he actually wanted, and then made sure that fix never happened. That's the strongest interpretation of the evidence we have, Thomas Bennett said. And I believe it's also the truth. He explained that we would be filing a formal petition to contest the will, citing undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity at the time of signing, and irregularities in the execution of the document, including the improperly interested witness. This will likely go to a hearing, he warned me. Your brother will have an opportunity to respond, to bring his own evidence, his own witnesses. This isn't going to resolve itself quietly behind closed doors. I want you to be fully prepared for that. I thought about every quiet moment over the past 8 months. Every time I'd swallowed my questions to keep the peace. Every time my mother had said, I trusted your brother to handle it. Every time Gregory had told me, with such casual confidence, that this was simply how things were now. I'm done being quiet, I told Thomas Bennett. File it. He nodded, and for just a moment, something in his expression softened. Not quite a smile, but close to it. Your father came to see me once, years ago, just to update some minor details in his original trust, he said. He told me that day that his greatest fear wasn't dying. It was leaving behind a mess that tore his children apart. I think, in a strange way, Margaret, what we're about to do honors exactly what he was afraid of losing. I drove home that evening with that sentence circling in my mind. My father's greatest fear hadn't been the cancer, or the pain, or even leaving my mother alone. It had been the possibility that the family he'd spent his whole life building might fracture once he was no longer there to hold it together. There was a painful irony in that. The very effort to honor his real wishes meant confronting the brother, whose actions had already begun fracturing exactly what our father feared losing. I called my mother that night to tell her the petition would be filed within the week. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Are you scared? She asked me finally. A little, I admitted. Are you? I think I've been scared for almost a year, she said. I just didn't let myself notice it until now. I'm not scared anymore, Maggie. I'm just ready for this to be over, one way or another. I understood exactly what she meant. After months of careful, quiet preparation, there was a strange relief in finally moving toward something, instead of simply gathering evidence in the dark. Whatever came next, at least we would finally be standing in the light, where the truth could be examined by someone with the authority to weigh it fairly. The petition to contest the will was formally filed on the first Monday of November. Gregory was served notice 3 days later. I wasn't there when it happened, but my mother told me, in a phone call afterward, that he had called her almost immediately, furious, demanding to know if she had put me up to this. I told him the truth, my mother said to me, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in months. I told him I didn't put anyone up to anything. I told him I simply wanted to know what really happened to your father's wishes. And then I told him something else. What did you tell him? I told him that if he had nothing to hide, he had nothing to be afraid of. And that if he did have something to hide, then he already knew what kind of son that made him. I sat with that for a long moment, struck by how far my mother had come from the woman who had once said, I trusted your brother to handle it, without a hint of doubt in her voice. Gregory's response, when it came through his own attorney, was predictable in its outline but still painful to read. He denied any wrongdoing. He claimed our father had been of completely sound mind in April, fully capable of understanding the will he signed. He claimed Patricia Voss's role as witness was incidental and that no laws had been broken. He suggested, through his attorney's careful legal language, that this entire contest was motivated by my own financial difficulties and lingering resentment over having left the family business. Reading that last part stung more than I expected it to. Not because it was true, my accounting practice was doing perfectly fine, but because it revealed plainly that Gregory's defense wasn't built on facts. It was built on rewriting my character, the same way he had once rewritten the story he told our mother about a conversation that never happened. Thomas Bennett wasn't worried. This is a common strategy, he told me. When someone doesn't have a strong factual defense, they attack the person bringing the claim instead of the claim itself. It tells us something important, Margaret. It tells us he doesn't have an answer for the signature, the witness, or your father's letter. He's hoping a judge will be distracted by a narrative about family conflict instead of looking closely at the evidence. Over the following weeks, both sides exchanged formal discovery requests. Gregory's attorney requested my financial records, presumably searching for evidence to support the claim that I was motivated by desperation rather than fairness. They found nothing useful because there was nothing to find. My practice was modest but stable, and I had never once, in any communication, suggested I didn't want my share of the estate. We, in turn, formally requested Daniel Pierce's complete file on the April will, his engagement records, his billing statements, any notes from his meetings with my father. Pierce's attorney resisted at first, citing client confidentiality, but Thomas Bennett argued successfully that allegations of fraud overrode that protection in this context. What we eventually received confirmed nearly everything we suspected. Pierce's billing records showed a single 30-minute meeting with my father, scheduled and paid for not by my father himself, but by Gregory's personal account. There was no record of any follow-up consultation, no record of any explanation of estate planning options, nothing resembling the careful, thorough process Thomas Bennett had always used with our family in the past. A hearing date was set for early January. I remember marking it on my calendar with a strange mixture of dread and relief. Dread for what the confrontation would mean for my family, relief that finally, the truth would have a place to be heard. The probate courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling that reminded me oddly of my father's old workshop. I sat at a table beside Thomas Bennett, my hands folded tightly in my lap, watching Gregory walk in with his attorney on the opposite side of the room. He didn't look at me. Not once. The judge, a woman named Judge Renata Alvarez, had clearly reviewed the case materials closely beforehand. She moved through procedural matters efficiently before turning the floor over to Thomas Bennett. He began by presenting my father's handwritten letter, reading the relevant section aloud. Spoke with Bennett today. He is drafting the updated documents. Will sign as soon as he sends them. He paired it with his own sworn statement confirming that no such follow-up consultation had ever taken place at his firm. Then he called Carol Whitfield to the stand. She walked the court through her forensic analysis methodically, explaining the pressure inconsistencies in the signature, the mismatched ink between the date and the signature itself, and her professional conclusion that the document showed signs of having been signed under significant physical strain. Gregory's attorney cross-examined her carefully, trying to suggest that natural variation in an elderly, ill man's signature could explain the discrepancies. Carol held her ground calmly. I've examined thousands of signatures from individuals in declining health, she said. Natural decline produces consistent, gradual changes. What I observed here is inconsistent within the same signing event, which suggests something other than simple illness. Next came the nurse's sworn statement, read into the record, describing the afternoon Gregory brought the same paperwork as before, for my father to sign during a period of increased pain medication and documented confusion. Then it was Patricia Voss's turn. Gregory's attorney had clearly hoped to present her testimony confidently, establishing her as a reasonable, disinterested witness. But under careful questioning from Thomas Bennett, she admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that she had been in a relationship with Gregory at the time of the signing, that she had never met my father before that day, and that Gregory himself had asked her to come along and sign as a witness, without much explanation of why. Did you understand at the time that as Gregory's romantic partner, you might not be considered a neutral witness under the law? Thomas Bennett asked. No, Patricia admitted quietly. I didn't think about it that way. I just thought I was helping. I watched Gregory's expression throughout her testimony. For the first time in this entire process, I saw something crack in his composure. Not guilt exactly, but the visible strain of a man watching his careful version of events come apart piece by piece in front of a judge who was clearly paying very close attention. When it was Gregory's turn to testify, his attorney tried to steer him toward steady, confident answers. Our father had been of sound mind. The will reflected his true wishes. Any inconsistencies were simply the natural result of illness. But under Thomas Bennett's cross-examination, the cracks widened further. Mr. Hale, Thomas Bennett asked, did you tell your mother that Margaret had personally agreed to be excluded from this will? Gregory hesitated. I characterized a conversation we'd had. Margaret had told me she didn't want to fight over money. Did Margaret ever tell you that specifically in relation to this will? A longer pause. Not specifically about this will, but generally over the years she'd said, Mr. Hale, Judge Alvarez interjected, her voice firm but not unkind. Please answer the question that was asked. Did your sister ever tell you specifically that she agreed to be excluded from your father's will? Gregory's shoulders dropped, just slightly. No, he said quietly. Not in those words. It wasn't a dramatic confession. There was no single explosive moment where Gregory broke down and admitted everything. But piece by piece, under careful, patient questioning, the story he had built for nearly a year came apart in front of everyone, including himself. During a brief recess, I stepped out into the hallway to get some water, and Gregory followed a few minutes later, standing near the water fountain at a careful distance from me. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. I didn't think it would go this far, he finally said, not quite looking at me. It went this far because you let it, Gregory, I said. I gave you so many chances to just tell me the truth. At the will reading, at the house, on the phone, more times than I can count. You chose this every single time. I thought I was protecting the business, he said, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. I thought if it got split up, divided between us, it would fall apart. I thought I was doing what was best, even if I went about it the wrong way. You don't get to decide what's best for someone else's inheritance by deciding what's easiest for you, I told him. Dad already decided what was fair. You just didn't like his answer. He didn't respond to that. He simply turned and walked back into the courtroom, and a few minutes later, the hearing resumed. I don't know if that conversation changed anything in how he understood what he'd done, but it mattered to me, hearing him admit, even partially, that he knew exactly what he had been doing all along. Closing arguments followed shortly after. Thomas Bennett's was measured and precise, walking the judge through every piece of evidence one final time, ending with a simple, quiet statement. Walter Hale spent his life building things that lasted. All we are asking this court to do is make sure his final wishes last as well. Gregory's attorney argued, with less conviction than before, that the irregularities, while concerning, did not necessarily prove fraud, and that the court should respect a father's documented decision regardless of how it had come about. Judge Alvarez listened without expression, thanked both sides for their presentations, and informed us that she would take the matter under advisement. Judge Alvarez took the matter under advisement and delivered her ruling 2 weeks later in writing. She found that the April will showed clear and convincing evidence of undue influence and irregular execution, citing the improperly interested witness, the forensic signature analysis, and the documented confusion during the signing. She ruled that the will was invalid and that my father's estate would instead be distributed according to his last validly executed will, the one from 6 years earlier that Thomas Bennett still had on file, splitting everything evenly between Gregory and me. I read that ruling 3 times before I let myself believe it was real. I'd like to tell you that winning the case felt like triumph. In some ways it did. There was relief, deep and physical, the kind that makes your shoulders drop after months of carrying tension you didn't even realize you'd been holding. There was vindication, knowing that my father's actual wishes, the ones he told me himself, holding my hand in that hospital room, had finally been honored. But mostly what I felt was sadness. Because winning this case meant I had to stand in a courtroom and prove, with documents and forensic analysis and sworn testimony, that my own brother had taken advantage of our dying father's vulnerability for his own benefit. There's no version of that victory that doesn't come wrapped in grief. Gregory and I don't speak anymore, not out of dramatic, bitter refusal, but because there simply isn't anything left to say that wouldn't reopen wounds that are still, even now, only partially healed. My mother speaks to him occasionally, carefully, the way you might speak to someone you love, but no longer fully trust. I think that's its own kind of quiet heartbreak, one I can't fix for her, no matter how much I wish I could. The house on Larkspur Lane was eventually sold, as Gregory had originally intended, but with the proceeds split evenly as my father had wanted. I used part of my share to help my mother settle comfortably into her condo, the way she should have been able to from the very beginning, with dignity and without anyone managing her decisions on her behalf. I think often about that Friday afternoon, staring at my microwave clock, almost letting an unfamiliar phone number go to voicemail. It's strange to think how close I came to missing the call that changed everything. Not because the truth wouldn't have existed without it, but because I might never have had the courage to go looking for it on my own. If there's a lesson in all of this, I think it's this. Trust is not the same thing as blind faith. My mother trusted Gregory to handle things, and that trust, given without questions, created the space for everything that followed. I'm not saying you should suspect everyone you love. I'm saying that love and accountability are not opposites. You can love someone deeply and still ask them hard questions. You can trust someone and still ask to see the paperwork. My father spent his life building things with his hands. Houses, a business, a family he hoped would stay close even after he was gone. In the end, it wasn't his hands that protected what he built. It was a letter he wrote with shaking fingers in his final months, a forensic examiner who knew how to read the truth in a signature, and a daughter who refused to let a single Friday phone call go unanswered. I don't know if Gregory will ever understand what he lost in all of this. Not just the house, not just half the company, but the version of himself that I used to admire, the brother who taught me to ride a bike on a gravel driveway and made me believe, for a little while, that he would always be someone I could trust completely. What I do know is this. My father's wishes were honored, finally, the way he intended them to be. And sometimes, that has to be enough. Not because the cost wasn't real, but because the truth, however painful, is always worth more than a comfortable lie. I think about Thomas Bennett sometimes too, and the strange role chance played in all of this. If my father hadn't asked, with his last clear strength, for someone to call Bennett. If that note hadn't survived in a small wooden box on a dresser. If I had let that unfamiliar number go to voicemail on an ordinary Friday afternoon. There were so many small moments where this story could have gone differently, where the truth could have simply stayed buried under grief and good intentions, and a family's quiet preference for peace over honesty. I don't think that makes what happened a matter of luck, though. I think it makes it a matter of paying attention, to small notes in a dresser drawer, to a daughter's instinct that something doesn't add up, to a phone call from an unfamiliar number that turns out to matter more than you could have imagined. My father spent his life teaching me, without ever saying it directly, that the small details are usually where the truth lives. I just didn't understand how literally I would need to apply that lesson until the year I lost him. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you for listening. And if there's one thing I hope you take with you, it's this. Never be afraid to ask for the paperwork. Never be afraid to make the call. The truth is always worth finding, even when it costs you something you didn't expect to lose.